who were getting licensed more than those who were provisional.
Yep.
And there were days where we basically just spent doing everything we had already done in seminary.
Mm-hmm.
I thought the preaching portion was a waste of time. They broke us into groups of 3, and then you had to go with some sort of mentor who listened to you preach, and they critiqued your preaching, and you had to write a sermon for absolutely no context, like just a very generic sermon, and they ripped everybody apart. I remember just thinking, like, I don't see how this is helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And we had to practice baptizing baby dolls.
I remember there were like 2 or 3 women who carried the dolls around for 2 weeks as though they were real children.
Yeah, I remember you saying something about that. That's
so freaking crazy.
At some point during ours, I remember, I don't remember the name of the man who was teaching the baptism portion, but he was teaching it, and someone, it might have been Drew, asked, what would you do if someone was gay and they wanted to be baptized? And the person basically said, kind of didn't really answer the question. But he said, if there's a baby that wants to be baptized, like if there's a couple that wants you to baptize their baby and the couple is gay, you cannot baptize their baby. And I remember just kind of doing like, what? Are you serious? Like, you're supposed to be teaching us about baptism and you're telling us we cannot baptize a baby if the parents are gay?
Oh, this is the instructor?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Well, they've never asked me to help teach, so that's part of the problem right there.
Maybe that's a good thing. I wouldn't want to.
I wouldn't want to either. I don't want to. If anyone listens to this, I do not want to do that.
I'm not going to put this in the episode. Happy ordinary time.
Well, let's do our best to make this as ordinary a conversation as we possibly can.
What did you have for breakfast this morning?
I didn't eat breakfast. I got up and came right here to have this conversation with you.
Because you're going to feast on the word.
That's so lame.
That's extraordinary. That's not ordinary.
Or as Jesus says, eat me.
Eat me. Indeed. If we are what we eat, this is like the worst. Like, my dad used to have a sticker on his bike helmet. I could make a whole podcast about the stickers my dad had on his motorcycle helmet. One of the stickers said, if you are what you eat, will I be you in the morning? And when I was 10, I didn't get it. But when I was 12, I did, and it kind of blew my mind. And I was really freaked out that my dad had that on his motorcycle helmet. But on a practical, what?
It's a zombie joke, right?
Sure. No, it's actually a liturgical, it's a sacramental joke.
Being consumed.
Yeah, and I think there was one that said, dip me in honey and throw me to the lesbians.
Don't include that one.
Yeah, I'm not going to put that on.
No, you should. It's funny. It's fine.
That'll be the title. Dip me in honey and throw me to the lesbians. We do have to talk practically. How do we want to sort of title or address these during ordinary time? Do we want to call this Ordinary Time 2 because it's technically the second Sunday of Ordinary Time? Do we want to call it Proper 6?
I would maybe just blah, blah, blah Sunday after Pentecost.
Okay, so this is the second Sunday after Pentecost that we're doing today.
Pentecost. Let's just do all 12 Sundays after Pentecost right now.
All of them?
I'm just joking.
So the readings for the second Sunday after Pentecost are Genesis 18, 1 through 15, Exodus 19, 2 through 8a, Romans 5, 1 through 8, and Matthew 9, 35 through 10, 8. So this is when no one comes to church because it's ordinary time.
That's not true. It's Father's Day. Actually, that is true. No one
comes to church on Father's Day.
Mothers want to go to church on Mother's Day, and fathers want to not go to church on Father's Day.
And in the Virginia Conference of the United Methodist Church, most pastors are not in church on Father's Day because it's annual conference Sunday.
I will be there with the brothers McClurg. Will be our special musical guests.
Very good for you. I'll be at annual conference.
Speaking of the brothers McClurg, because they've got this like giant white boy Jufros, I went to get a haircut Saturday, right before the Saturday service. And for at least 25 minutes, this hairdresser in her broken English just kept making really loud comments about, well, when your hair is thinning and you're going bald like you are, you can do this to it or that to it. And then she's like out loud in front of 8 other, customers trying to like sell me some sort of hair growth treatment. And then she takes what looks like a horse brush or like a doll brush
And ran it through your hair.
and is like trying to poof my hair up and then spraying crap all over it. And so like it was the worst haircut and the most shaming experience I've ever had. And I left that. I had shorts and a t-shirt on, and I had hair that needed a leisure suit. It was awful.
Yeah. My father gave me an electronic laser something hair. I don't even know what it's called, but he gave it to me. He was like, well, I bought this for myself, but my hair is fine, so I thought I'd give it to you. And this was like 2 years ago. I've literally never used it. It probably cost a fortune. It's in the bottom of some closet. But it's all relevant because for next Sunday, we're going to be talking about how Jesus has counted the number of hairs on our head, which is easier for you and I than for others. All right, so
it was awful though. I had to come to church, and I washed my hair in the bathroom before I got ready for worship.
Before worship.
I looked like Joe Pesci in like a Goodfellas flashback. It was terrible.
Well, at least you didn't look like Joe Pesci after Macaulay Culkin burned the top of his head. Which, by the way, this is completely off topic, but Home Alone is a remarkably violent movie.
It is. It's a great movie.
It's a great movie, but it's kind of terrifying. Like, he tortures those 2 men, the sticky bandits, the wet bandits.
He's a recurring character in Louis C.K.'s TV show. I think that's hilarious.
Yeah, it's great movie. Okay.
So you want to talk about here?
Second Sunday after Pentecost, the Genesis 18 reading is, I made the case last week, or the last episode we recorded, that this is a better reading for Trinity Sunday, because I have always been taught that here, when the strangers come up to Abraham, that is a moment when all 3 members of the Trinity are together. But one of the things that I appreciate for ordinary time, it doesn't happen all throughout the rest of the liturgical year, but we really do have all these passages connect from week to week. If you follow the Old Testament throughout summer, throughout ordinary time, you're going to get a lot of Genesis and Exodus. If you follow the alternate reading, you're going to get to go through a lot of the prophets. If you follow the second reading, you're going to go through almost all of Romans, which you're doing at your church. And I think that's something doesn't happen as often in churches anymore. We kind of do these series on particular topics, or we just bounce around and pick and choose what we want. But it can be really helpful to read through an entire narrative during a season, particularly a long one like ordinary time.
Yeah, I think Lectio Continua is the best discipline for preaching. I don't know what you think, but I know that, right now I've got 14 books on apocalyptic Pauline theology, and I'm just like nerding out on it. And I know, that whether people can hear a difference or not, I don't know, but my preaching will be stronger because I would have been in the same text for so long.
Yeah. I mean, I know that my preaching is better when I preach from, like, for instance, the Gospel of Mark, just because I've spent more time in Mark and I see more of the connections with Mark than I do. Like, if I just randomly preach on Zechariah, I spend so little time in Zechariah that it's going to be weak. I kind of feel like my preaching on the Psalms is weak because, 1, it's not narrative, and 2, I don't spend as much time in the Psalms as I probably should.
Yeah, I think Lectio Continua is, like, Calvin was right about many things, but I think the necessity of preaching from beginning to end is probably his biggest chunk of wisdom. So, yeah. So Genesis 18. So not only is it, like, what strikes me about Genesis 18 isn't just that it gives us this revelation of God as community, as Trinity. It's also that I think you have to read the sacrifice of Isaac in the context of the larger Abraham narrative.
Right. Well, because that's next week too. I mean, it's all about, keep going.
And I think so much of the interpretation of the sacrifice of Isaac, it becomes a text of terror only when you make the modern assumption that God doesn't really act or speak. And so what happens is that you take this narrative and you put it in the form of a monologue inside of Abraham's head.
Mm-hmm.
And so he thinks God wants him to do this. And it's this voice from God that he hears in his head. And God's not actually a character with whom Abraham has a history and upon which Abraham has reason to trust God. And so so not only has God actually spoken to Abraham in the past, it's, God has actually supped with Abraham here.
Yeah. I mean, his feet have been washed. It's as intimate as you can get. Yeah. And I think we'll talk about this when we get to the sacrifice of Isaac, because that's the fourth Sunday after Pentecost. But I do think you're right. There are particular narratives within the greater narrative that, the story of Israel is a very, very long story, but it all sort of makes sense in light of the delivery out of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
You have to always be thinking about that with every story of Israel. And God makes that apparent because he always says, I am the God who delivered you out of Egypt. But the same thing kind of holds true in the Gospels. There are certain narratives that, like the cross, you kind of have to keep thinking about the cross when you read about, Jesus healing blind man. But I think the sacrifice of Isaac is one of the things that many preachers would rather avoid, but it is important to keep in light of all the other stories from Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
I do like how Abraham asks, my Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by me.
Mm-hmm.
A recognition that we're not deserving of all of this, that the Lord could just keep on walking by. It reminds me a lot of Emmaus. Jesus is walking with the disciples, the two on the road, and his desire is to just keep on walking.
Yep.
He has other things to do. They're not so important that he has to stop and stay with them, but they ask for it. And I think that I've been bringing this up a lot, but I feel like we need to hear and to preach that God is God and we are not.
Yeah.
We've tried in our own way to build another tower in Babel. And I think maybe our role as preachers is to break that tower down.
Sounds like a Pentecost sermon though, Taylor. Are you previewing next Sunday's Pentecost sermon?
I don't know what I'm going to say for Pentecost yet.
This is June 18th now. It's like you're going back in time.
I know, but sometimes that's what Scripture does. It's timeless.
Speaking of timeless, that Back in Time Huey Lewis and the News song is so great. I love it. Yeah. Wouldn't pay money to go see them live anymore, but so.
That's why YouTube is wonderful. What I don't know is if the pericope includes Sarah laughing.
It does.
It does. Do you make a lot of that? I've heard entire sermons based on Sarah laughing.
I mean, it's interesting. I can't imagine. I can't imagine a sermon based on her laughing. I don't know that that's a relevant sermon, or is in any way having to do with the main point. But I can see that. There aren't a lot of chuckles in the Old Testament.
No, that's definitely true. I do think maybe to a degree that when we encounter the divine, we're either going to be afraid or we're going to laugh because we can't believe God would choose us to do something.
Or that God would come to us in the form that God comes to us. I think that, I think it's Brian Blunt who argues that the centurion and Mark at Jesus' cross, truly this was God's son, is being sarcastic.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's really interesting because I've always heard about the faithfulness of the Gentiles in the gospel because they're the ones, especially in Mark, because the disciples never see him as the Messiah, but the centurion does. That's interesting. So he's sarcastic.
That's the best way of reading a gospel, where Easter ends with women running away afraid and not telling anyone.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. I got to remember that.
Yeah. So it would be interesting to pair her laughing here, kind of dismissing God, with the centurion dismissing the possibility of Jesus being God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, laughing at the forms at which God takes.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, as we look at the other texts for this particular Sunday, during other, particular liturgical seasons in the calendar, the four readings really tie really nicely together. And I don't think that happens as well during ordinary time.
Mm-hmm.
To your point before, Lectio Continua, if you got to, if you're going to do it, you got to try to connect it, vertically, which is to say, go Genesis, keep connecting it to the reading the week before, and you can do it with the other readings. I just think the burden is a little bit harder because they're not as easy to tie to one another. The Exodus reading is from Exodus 19, which is when Moses is told what to say to the Israelites. This is, a chapter before they receive the 10 Commandments. And I like more than anything how the people respond. God tells Moses to tell him, hey, this is what I did for you. I delivered you out of Egypt, broken record over and over again. That you must obey my voice and keep my covenant because you are a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. And the people all answered as one. Everything that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Bullshit. The whole rest of the Old Testament is their failure to do what they say.
What verses are those?
It's Exodus 19, 2 through 8.
2 through 8. See, it's interesting because I have the United Methodist Lectionary book right here of readings, and Exodus 19 is not in it. You've seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant. There we go.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what do you want to say about that for our faithful listeners?
We do a lot of things in worship as one. I think this is a good time to talk about why we do what we do in worship. Because I know at Aldersgate you all sing "America the Beautiful" every week, so you should probably talk about. I'm just kidding. But we, like, for instance, we say at St. John's, we say the Apostles' Creed together in one voice every week, and I think that the Israelites respond as one. Everything that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and that's just not true. And I don't know, if the things we say as one, if we mean them either. And I would think about breaking down some of the stranger parts of, like, let's say the Lord's Prayer or the Apostles' Creed and saying, we say this as one, but do we do it? Do we believe it? Do we mean it the way that, the Israelites respond? Because we know what happens in the rest of the story. They fail to do it. But, for me, when I preached for Ascension Sunday, I talked about how one of the lines in the Apostles' Creed is that we believe that Jesus ascended to the right hand of the Father. And I don't know if we actually believe it.
Mm-hmm. Because
if we do, that means we really believe that Jesus is Lord of our life, and that means that all of our priorities should change.
Well, it's formative, right? Because Israel's saying this in the wilderness, and part of the point of the wilderness is to get, to detox from their slavery to Pharaoh.
# Morgan Guyton.
I think one of the dominant themes of the Exodus narrative is that they're not capable of doing what they say. And that's why it takes them so long to travel not very far.
Mm-hmm.
And it works the same for us. That the reason we say the Creed and the Lord's Prayer every Sunday is to be formed into a people capable of actually living it, which may take a lifetime or more.
Mm-hmm. I do think too that this short passage is a good reminder for preachers about what the task of preaching is to show and to tell what God has done.
Mm-hmm.
God says to Moses to say to the people, you have seen what I have done to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Preaching at its best is pointing away from the preacher to the cross and showing and telling, not necessarily explaining, but showing and telling what God has done.
Like John the Baptist pointing at Jesus in the Grunwald altarpiece.
Who was it, Jason Michelli, that used to keep a picture of that next to the door in his office? Was
the long bony finger of John the Baptist out of scale to the rest of the picture.
Mm-hmm. And there's just this really sweet, cute little lamb in the bottom, bleeding out of its neck into a bucket. But we can say it and talk about it in jest. However, preaching at its best is pointing away from oneself to the word and showing and telling what God has done.
And trusting that that's what people actually want. I think that's important.
Whether or not it's what they want, it's certainly what they need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I mean, this is different, but related to the Exodus passage with the Romans passage, also assigned for this Sunday. It's interesting. It's interesting what Paul doesn't say in Romans. That Paul never uses the word covenant, and he doesn't ever refer to Abraham's obedience, and he never uses the phrase "the God of Israel." And so I think it was Beverly Gaventa, my old teacher. She made the analogy of Paul in Romans to someone writing a biography of Abraham Lincoln, where they didn't mention his impoverished childhood in Kentucky or the Emancipation Proclamation, and made just passing reference to the Civil War. And if you read a biography like that about Lincoln, you'd be like, "What's going on? Like, and that you should, as a reader, a Jewish Christian in Rome, be wondering what Paul's doing by leaving these key parts out." So yeah, it's interesting.
So what do you think Paul is doing by keeping these things out?
Well, I mean, to connect to what you were just saying, that that Paul's point is that God is the actor in our salvation, and it's all gratuitous and it's all prevenient, and Abraham is no different than the Gentiles who contribute absolutely nothing.
Right.
That even Abraham's faith is not to be exemplified or lauded because it itself is the creation of God.
Yeah, that's. I feel like we keep whittling Bart down a lot, but his Romans commentary, Der Römerbrief, is pretty much him talking about, or at least lots of it is him talking about how Abraham's faith being reckoned to him as righteousness. That faith that Abraham has is only possible because it's constituted by God.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. I mean, we tend to use Abraham as this example. Oh, he went into a strange new land. He didn't know what it was going to be like. Nobody would have done that back in his day, but he can only do that because of God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's almost like God is like, a giant wave at the ocean, just pushing him along.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's, because it's interesting to me that, there's so much about, we're just hardwired into if-then conditions. If we have enough faith, if we believe, if we repent, if we serve, then God will do X, Y, or Z. And that has nothing to do with the gospel whatsoever. For Paul, it's just but now, and then God does stuff.
Yeah, and I think if you read a lot of sermons, you can tell how that language has changed. If you read these sort of very, very, very old sermons that we have from the church fathers and so on and so forth, they don't use if-then language.
Mm-hmm.
If-then language sort of starts around the 50s and 60s with the psychologization of the church.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever a preacher felt like they had to be a psychologist. And I think, this time after World War II and, people were in church all the time. That's all right. Like around when the if-then language started to become very popular in the church. And it still is.
What's interesting, and just because I've been reading in Romans so much, it's interesting that Paul doesn't use the word repent, because that's something that we do. And Paul, the only time, and I think in the wider letters, not just Romans, the only time Paul talks about forgiveness is when he's telling the Corinthians that he'll try to forgive them for the hurt they've done to him, but forgiveness isn't really a practice or a category that he has.
Yeah, and I think too, one of the things that I've found to be interesting in serving a local church is the biblical illiteracy is, that's kind of obvious, but also I'd shared with some people because I preached through Romans during Lent, and we did a Bible study that was concurrent with it where we could get way more in depth about what was going to happen in worship. And every time we had Sunday school, I shared with them that Paul's letters were all written before the first gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And that blew people's minds.
I don't know how people don't know that.
They had never, ever heard that. They had never thought about it. And you could see the wheels ticking in their minds because all of a sudden everything was being reframed in terms of their own theology and understanding. This is what the church believed before anyone sat down to write an account of the life of Jesus Christ. The letters of Paul are way more important than we give them credit for.
Well, it's why, it's why the Jesus seminar is stupid, Because
Oh gosh, let's just talk about that.
I mean, like the early church was baptizing and breaking bread in the name of the Trinity long before there was anything called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So like,
Yeah.
why we dicker over like, discrepancies between the gospels is just inane.
Yeah, and the way that the Jesus Seminar did it, all right, with this black, BB, we believe this is absolutely Jesus said this. With this green BB, this is maybe he said it, maybe he didn't. If it's blue, he definitely didn't say it. Like that, that's just so.
Oh, and just the way that like the trends of historical biblical scholarship just shift, where like before John was very, very late and, and now like that's not actually like, what is, the consensus. It's just silly. It's just silly that we don't need the gospels to proclaim the gospel message that Paul gave us first. I mean, just the fact that the early church decided to put Paul's letters at the very center of the New Testament, because like that's the glue that holds it together.
Right.
Because I'm just being a dead horse, because the gospels are not self-interpreting. Like that's
why we have 4 of them.
Like that's I've complained about this about people who don't preach sermons on Good Friday and just read the Passion narrative. Like that's not helpful, because the Passion narrative never explains what it's trying to convey. Like you need Paul to interpret the gospels.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good example, like with the Matthew 9 reading, like because otherwise, like if you don't read this in light of Paul's larger theology, like this just becomes, an episode. It's then too tempting to just analogize it to something in our own human experience.
Right. Yeah. Because when like in Matthew, when he says the harvest is plentiful and the laborers are few, therefore ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. We can just so water that down to
you make it you make it a freaking sermon about volunteering at church.
Exactly.
Like, oh my gosh, that's not what it's freaking about.
Right. When you read it with Romans 5 and you talk about how suffering produces endurance and endurance produces character, and then it ends with, but God proves his love for us that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. This isn't about volunteering for something after church. It's recognizing that you don't deserve any of this.
Well, and it's recognizing that, like, because it's important that, like, so like in Romans chapter 1, Paul says, that through the gospel, God's like rectifying power is invading the world,
Mm-hmm.
and then in chapter 3, he sets up the enemy as the power of sin with a capital S, and then in chapter 5, he makes that synonymous with death with a capital D. And so that, like, if you understand what the world as Paul sees it, and then like you see what Matthew's trying to do here, like this is Jesus contending with the powers.
Mm-hmm.
That's what this is about. But if you read that without the prism of like Paul's theology, it just gets watered down to just, a sermon about human potential.
Mm-hmm. This is how you can serve your church this week.
Oh my gosh. And then, like, that's the least interesting. Even if you went to like a really like awesome church, it would still be boring.
No, because where's God?
And it just sounds like your mother-in-law. Like, well, we really need to be doing, like it's just terrible, but it is Father's Day. And so like, I think there's certain holidays like Memorial Day, 4th of July, Father's Day, that like where like, if all preachers do is point out that what we mean by love in our culture is not what we mean by love in the gospel. Like, if you just do that, you've done your job. Mm-hmm. And so to point out that, like, it's not, I mean, sure, like, there are a lot of shitty fathers. Like that's not, I mean, I'm the product of one. So, I mean, that's important, right? But there's something, like, very natural and biological about loving your children. Like, of course you love your children because they look just like you. So there's a level at which you shouldn't be praised for loving something that like you produced. Which is to say that like Jesus's love of the ungodly is like categorically different.
Right. Absolutely.
That like, like it's just like Memorial Day, where like, it's not like a small thing to die for your country, but like the very form in which we organize soldiers is based upon the knowledge that if you put men into like a small group, like they will like willingly offer their lives for the person next to them. Mm-hmm. Like it's just, that's hardwired into our human nature.
Yeah.
And that is different than the kind of love revealed to us in Christ.
And we've talked about this, but I read a sermon that Fleming Rutledge wrote on this Romans 5 text about Christ dying for the ungodly. And she said this is years ago, but she said, who is the worst person you can think of right now? This is right after September 11th. And she said, for many of us, it's probably Osama bin Laden. Can you imagine our president asking our soldiers to go halfway across the world to die for Osama bin Laden?
Mm-hmm.
That's what God was willing to do.
Boom.
And we don't have categories for even comprehending what that's like. And we just dismiss it as something, well, that's not really what it's about, or, whatever. But I also think we must always remember, because when we hear ungodly, we think about people on the other side of the world that are doing things. We are the ungodly. That's why it says Christ died for us while we were yet sinners.
Because the problem, the problem with, I think in most mainline churches, we avoid sin talk generally anyway. But to the extent that we talk about sin, we preach against sins that our listeners already are in agreement against, so we preach against, and, so in the Methodist Church, we preach against sexism and racism and homophobia. And even though that might be present in the pews, everyone agrees that those are bad things.
Mm-hmm.
We seldom lift up what ungodly means for the people in our pews.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess in more conservative churches, they just focus on sin as vice and virtue in individual people.
I think the sin of idolatry is perhaps our worst. And I've tried to talk about it a lot in the church, and that's the one that people would rather ignore the most.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I don't worship my job and my car and my money and my country. Those don't get between me and God. What are you talking about?
Yeah, I think idolatry is the only bipartisan thing that we share in America right now, I think.
Yeah.
Besides a general agreement that Donald Trump doesn't know what he's doing. I do think there's broad consensus on that too. Whether you hope he succeeds or not.
I didn't even ask how much the new building cost. Not going to do it. I didn't even ask how much money was in the offering plate yesterday.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah.
Second Sunday after Pentecost.
Are we done already?
We got to do the next one.
Okay.
Third Sunday after Pentecost.
Did you say Nerd Sunday or third?
Nerd!
Is that a Tetris shirt? What are you wearing?
It's a mission trip shirt. It says Seek at the bottom.
Got it.
Got it on a mission trip. This is the third Sunday after Pentecost, June 25th, 2017. For United Methodists, this is, for many of them, it will be their last Sunday at their church before they move, including me. The readings are Genesis 21, 8 through 21. There's Jeremiah 20, 7 through 13. Romans 6, 1 through 11. And Matthew 10, 24 through 39. Jason.
Yes, Taylor.
Should we continue in sin in order that grace may abound? Hell no.
It's funny, yeah. Someone was telling me, so that I can't say this on there. No. Well, I mean, they were telling me, so they were in a relationship with someone, and what they wanted from this person was different than what the person wanted. Their, second, recently divorced and all that, and this person, was kind of lamenting to me that they can't separate sex from love, and they asked my advice, and I was like, just keep trying. But I was joking.
Yeah.
That's
great pastoral wisdom. Yeah.
Well, sometimes it's important to catch people by surprise,
Mm-hmm.
and then let the gospel advice sneak in on the slant.
Sure.
There's a method to my madness.
I'm trying to figure out how to say this without giving anything away. Someone came to my office who has embarked on a new relationship with someone, and they're in their 70s. and they both have not. They're both divorced, and they haven't been in relationships for like 20 years, and they're sort of newly together. And the woman came to me because she wanted to talk about their relationship and all this stuff, and asked me what I thought about it. And then it became very obvious that she was really there to ask me if it was okay for her to have sex with him. And I'm 50 years younger than her. And I could tell that that's where the conversation was heading. So instead of just like drawing it out for 30 minutes, I said, name, are you here because you want to have permission to have sex with him? And she, oh, no, 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 no. Oh, no, 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 no. Well, what do you think? I said, if do you feel like this is a holy thing that you're sharing? It's like, well, I haven't thought about it like that. So, well, if it's a holy thing, then who am I to tell you what you can or can't do? Now, please leave my office.
I mean, yeah, it is how frequently we turn, what we perceive as religious obligations into a burden. I remember Dr. Dykstra, my pastoral counseling professor and Jedi master, one time saying that, the right thing to do is almost always what seems like the selfish thing to do. And that's not always true, but I think, especially in counseling, I've found that like sometimes people just need permission to receive grace.
I would say that without a doubt, the overwhelming majority of the people that have come to sit in my office to share something or to ask something, they just want to have permission to do what they already know is the thing they need to do.
Mm-hmm.
They're not coming because they need to hear me tell them what to do. They already know. They just need to hear someone sort of bless that.
Yeah, the dark side of that is that in 16 years, couples who come for like, marriage counseling, like, they're having problems in their marriage. I think by the time, like, for most men, when they get to that stage, they're just doing it to check off the box and excuse leaving. That I think once they get to someone like my office, saving the marriage isn't really what they want. And again, yeah, so that what they want is permission to do what they want to do.
Well, I guess we can sort of tie that together to Genesis 21 because Abraham wants to get rid of one of his sons.
Why not?
Yeah, let's talk about how Genesis 21 is sort of the foundation for most of the problems we have in the world today.
What do you mean?
This is the beginning of the remarkable split between factions of Islam that have led to the murder of many, 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 many people. Not that Christianity is any better. We've probably done far worse for the world than.
What's that joke? All those Palestinians and Jews, why can't they just get along like Christians?
Yeah, that's good. No, but so Genesis 28 is the story of Sarah getting jealous of seeing Hagar with her natural born son, Isaac, and then asking her husband to cast her away.
So what would you do with this passage, Taylor?
I don't know. I've never preached it. I've kind of avoided it. I would say maybe to a degree that even though Hagar gets cast off, God doesn't abandon her. But that feels kind of like a whitewashing of the story. You know what I mean? Well, it's true, but I don't think that like confronts it the way that it needs to be.
Well, I don't know. I don't know what, like the whole kind of postmodern apologetic stance towards scripture. I mean, maybe none of that is necessary. Maybe like we just have to like accept that this isn't a story that's trying to obey our sensibilities
or our ethics or our norms.
Yeah. And it like so many of these quote unquote troubling passages in the Old Testament, if you just tell them straight up to children in a children's story, the kids aren't going to be like asking these, first naivete type questions. And so maybe we just need to accept that. And that maybe, since this is a story about God, maybe we just need to accept that this is an episode, and that, Hagar being dismissed, but God being with her, that like, these are all just pieces of God's kind of providential purposing in Israel's history and in our history.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, the promise to Hagar is the same promise made to Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
I will make of him, a father of many nations because he is your offspring. And so, I think one of the things that is important is the fact that the covenant isn't removed from him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But you're right. I mean, we're anachronistic in our reading.
Mm-hmm.
We want Jesus to be we want Jesus to be a Republican, or we want Jesus to be a Democrat. And when that doesn't, and we want God to do the same. And when that doesn't match up, we preachers run the risk of explaining the passage rather than proclaiming it.
Yeah, because I know as a preacher, I don't want to be perceived as medieval or superstitious. Even so, I understand this text on like a second naivete level, but my listeners aren't going to know that, and you can't explain all that away without like the sermon just dying a slow death in your hands. I mean, part of it, I wonder like how much bad preaching is produced by preachers being afraid of being perceived as antiquated,
Mm-hmm.
or mythological or what have you. But like if you were going to take that kind of our kind of natural modern reaction to what happens to Hagar, like I think you could attach to Sarah's jealousy and insecurity that, what that is already early on in the scripture story is, her bondage to the power of death.
Mm-hmm.
That these these sins are manifestations of the power of sin with a capital S.
Mm-hmm.
But,
And to make your point that you made last week, that this story connects with the following week's passage about the sacrifice of Isaac,
mm-hmm.
because it is, to talk about this whole narrative that's happening inside of Abraham's head. It's not just that he's taking a son up there. He's already sent away the other son.
Mm-hmm.
This is now his only son.
Mm-hmm.
And so perhaps one of the things that can be helpful is reading this in light of what happens next.
Yeah, because I just read, so Elizabeth Palmer, I know you listen, she just wrote a book about the sacrifice of Isaac, and so she asked me to read a PDF of it to blurb her book, which is was hard to do. But so she analyzes how Kierkegaard and Luther both read the Abraham and Isaac story, and it's interesting how so Kierkegaard just concludes that this is just a horrible religious moment, where Abraham just has to accept that God is this God that can't be predicted or categorized or even loved, as we would use the word. And Luther wants to avoid all of those problems by saying that Abraham already knew there was a ram in the bush, and all of that, and so he's just kind of going through the motions of what God tells him to do. But neither one of them want to couch it in this larger like story that Abraham has with God, for which Abraham has reason to trust that whatever God is doing. And it's interesting, I didn't really realize it before, but like that's the last part of the Abraham story, that we don't hear from him again after that.
Yep.
So there is something awful and conclusive to that story.
Mm-hmm. But we can talk about that more next week. The next reading is Jeremiah 20, 7 through 13. I love this. For I hear many whispering. Terror is all around. Denounce him. Let us denounce him. All my close friends are watching for me to stumble. Perhaps he can be enticed and we can prevail against him and take our revenge on him.
What are the verses on that? Again, this is not in my...
It's Jeremiah 20, 7 through 13.
7 through 13. So what would you do with this? I don't know that I have ever preached from the book of Jeremiah.
Ever?
I mean, maybe I have some. I mean, I'm old, but I don't know. Actually, I really can't think of
I made a promise to
anytime.
myself that my first year in ministry, I was going to preach about Jeremiah 29:11, just so that I could preach about it within the context of the greater like scheme of what's happening there. So I did that my first year, and I've preached on the beginning of Jeremiah's call, and this call to build and to plant and to pluck up and destroy. So I
Mhm.
think that's really good stuff. I've definitely never preached on Jeremiah 20, but I think one of the things I would maybe do with it is. Just that one verse that I just read, this idea that our close friends are watching for us to stumble, that we
Mhm.
so live in that world today. We are always waiting for one small mistake, and that one small mistake can change everything about someone's life.
Mhm.
You think about like the newscaster who is trying to read from the teleprompter and they say "fuck" by accident on live television.
I am Ron
And
Burgundy.
yeah, but now if somebody does that, they might not ever get that job ever again. They can't even move to like another city because it's on YouTube and it becomes
Uh-huh.
famous for everything. And Kurt Vonnegut once said that the great thing about today is if you mess up on television, if you make a mistake on television, at least you will have entertained us. And
Have you watched Californication?
no, I mean I know what it is, but
Like David
with David
Duchovny's like
Duchovny,
best friend in that. He's like an agent, and he's just a compulsive masturbator, and so he's like in his office like looking at porn and masturbating, and that somehow gets like there's like security cameras I guess in the office, and then like they post that to YouTube or whatever, and I think that's in the first episode, and so like the entire history of the show, like he's known to everyone he interacts
for
with
that.
as this
Hmm.
compulsive masturbator, which I
I mean,
didn't
like,
think was going to come up with Jeremiah 20.
no, neither did I. But I mean, now I'm thinking about Anthony Weiner.
The word works in mysterious ways.
Because like think about how many people have had their lives ruined by just one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And um, when you stumble that one time, for a lot of people, they can never get back up again. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't mean to be like way too psychological about this, but uh, what day is this? This is the 25th. I think this would be a great time to have the sacrament of communion to talk about how we are not defined by the times we stumble, that
Mm-hmm.
even when we stumble, we're forgiven and offered a space at this table. Like, I just think that that's, especially today. I mean, I think about talking to young, like teenagers about this. I have friends, just the things I see people post online. I always this is terrible, but in the back of my mind, I think I could screenshot this
Mm-hmm.
and post this, and their lives would be ruined forever.
Mm-hmm.
But that's like the world we live in, and at least it's comforting to know that in the realm of the Lord, we are not defined by the times we stumble.
And that's
That's not a
real. I
very
mean,
good sermon, but
but it's real though. I mean, we're talking about sin and death, right? In these texts. I mean, so I have a friend whose life was ruined by allegations that were left on blog sites and stuff like that, and people just took it as true, and that's not a form in which you can ever prove that it's not true. And some allegations you can't really ever undo. And my oldest son now is as he's right at the age where guys that he knows are pressuring girls into giving them blowjobs, for which those girls will forever be shamed for having done so. So like there are things that like people can't take back, but they should not be judged by.
I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful that I did not come of age during a time with iPhones.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like, I think about that all the time. I am so thankful that I had a Nokia cell phone that could play Snake on it, and that was it.
I
Because
didn't have a cell phone until after I graduated from college.
I mean, yeah, because when you were in seminary, you had to write your essays on parchment paper, right?
Little blue
With a
books.
with a quill,
Little blue books.
with an ink quill.
I did have to walk
like
to the
candlelight.
computer lab to check email. Yeah, no, I had like a Nokia phone that costs like a small fortune for 200 minutes a month or something like that. And I've learned a lot from Dr. Dennis Wayne Perry about how to see people's mistakes in the context of like a larger life and contribution. That like when it's come up, like, do we need to like fire them, or just like I'm much quicker to like, and he's much more gracious in wanting to not reduce, everything this person's done to this one infraction or mistake.
Because we are human.
We are.
So
Yeah.
should
So
we,
Jeremiah
should
20,
we-
I think I think, like the larger Jeremiah story is important, I think, because of, we've talked about it in terms of like the reality and activity of the word of God. And what you see in Jeremiah is that the word of the Lord is so real and so active that it is, a burden, almost an albatross around Jeremiah's neck. Yeah, I always think of Jeremiah like I think of Frodo carrying the ring. That if he could take it back, this is not the life he would want. He would have, like, Jeremiah would like to stay back in the Shire.
Yeah, so I guess like the equivalent is, why didn't the Eagles just drop the ring into the lava from the very beginning? Why didn't God just make the people stop sinning? I don't know. So I guess then
Maybe that's so sin can abound.
I know. So for Romans 6, I think this is a great passage for we preachers today, because as we've talked about this episode and the last episode, we just largely don't talk about sin anymore. And the sins that we do talk about, we already kind of assume and know that people already know that they're wrong, and they don't hear themselves when they hear it talked about. But should we continue in sin in order that grace may abound? Hell no. How can we who died to sin go on living in it?
Yeah, there's a lot of, like, if you are a preacher and you don't choose Romans 6 out of all of these passages, you're a fool, I think. Because there's so many directions you could take it. Like, it drives me crazy that in the United Methodist Church, we have defined baptism around what we call prevenient grace. And it's not even clear to me, like, what we mean by prevenient grace, that like we know what we're talking about when we say it, because we just reduce that to like, well, God says yes to you before you can say yes to God. But really, like, Paul's language is that you are literally like baptized into Jesus's death. Like, he's not being metaphorical, that you have now died to the power of death. And so that's why it's inconceivable for Paul that you would continue in sin, because like this is a reality you've passed through, like Israelites in the Red Sea. So like you could take it in that direction, like you could take it in the direction of this dynamic of we are all slaves to the power of sin, and so the first understanding of sin is as bondage. And yet we're still responsible for that which we commit in our bondage, which is an interesting dynamic. But
we're all held captive to the capital S sin, which is capital D death. So much of the world today is about ignoring the truth that no one makes it out alive.
Oh yeah, yeah, and I think
every commercial, every television show, every magazine cover. I mean, that's why Hauerwas says that the most difficult thing about being a pastor is telling people the truth, is telling them that they're going to die when everyone and everything else is telling them the contrary.
Yeah, and I think because you have to connect Romans 6 with Romans 8, where Paul's, he's asking, what can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus, and he named, and the things he names aren't just like experiences, like those are the forms that sin
that can separate us. Yeah.
And so that, like, where we see the power of death at work in the world is in nakedness and famine. And not to like dump on Donald Trump all the time, but like, there was a palpable surprise among progressives after the election that like we are not as evolved and sophisticated a country as people thought we were. And I think the extent to which we were surprised by that betrays just how little we understand or believe about the power of sin as Christians understand it.
And to bring it back to the Jeremiah reading, as of our recording of this, Donald Trump just returned from his first tour to other parts of the world. And it's been so funny to me that he is being congratulated for not messing up more.
Yeah.
Like, to talk about, like, we're always looking for people to stumble. people are analyzing him to such a degree under a microscope that the fact that he didn't mess up is to some people worthy of, exaltation.
But he is one of the ungodly for whom Christ died.
He is, and we must never, ever, ever forget that.
Yeah, I mean,
when he comes to your church on a communion Sunday, you still got to offer him the body.
well, and we don't pass it out in a tray, so he won't be confused and put money in it. So he actually has to.
Don't you think he would take the money out?
Maybe.
But a disciple and a president is not above the teacher.
Although, I think it'd be good PR for President Trump if he gave us a sufficient amount of money to pay off the debt on our education building. I would name it the Donald J. Trump Education Building, where kids learn to read good.
But how do they fit inside of such a small building?
Okay, we need to so obviously the language of slavery connects Romans 6 and Romans 10. And which you already know, the word slave is one of the most frequently used words in the New Testament.
Yep. It was on my first spelling test in Greek 101 because it along with Kai and adelphos and a handful of other words occur more in the New Testament than any other word.
Chi doesn't really count though. You can't count conjunctions. That's silly. But
favorite seminary story. Went to go play trivia at a local bar, and the last question to the last round was what word appears in the Bible more than any other word. And I went, fuck yeah, I know this. And I was there with people from seminary, and they were like, is it God? Is it Amen? Is it Jesus? I was like, no, you idiots. It's and. It's Kai. And I wrote it in Greek and in English when I turned it in. And when the guy read it off, he's like, well, only one group got the answer right. And it's those assholes from the divinity school because they wrote it in Greek and in English. And so I was cheering, and then I was shamed.
I went to a trivia night in seminary in town in Princeton, and that led to, let's just say debauchery. That led to us taking our friend Houston to the emergency room because one of us accidentally punched and broke his nose.
I thought you were going to say something like stabbed him or shot him or
something.
But
we were just, to tell you about the condition we were in at the time, before we went to the hospital, I mean, he had blood. We stopped at Wawa for sandwiches. So should we continue in sin so the grace may abound?
Hell no.
Yeah. So, but the dynamic of, the language of sin and the language of salvation are both a language of bondage.
Mm-hmm. Slavery, captivity.
And it's really just a matter, I mean, that's what I always try to impress upon people, who are getting married and when they give me this nonsense about we just want our kids to, choose their own religion when they grow up by themselves and to make them see that it's not really a choice between religion or no religion. It's, which master are you going to have?
Right.
As Bob Dylan said, got to serve somebody.
Yeah. And particularly since we don't ever let our children choose whether to be allegiant to America. Mm-hmm. We don't leave that to be a choice. So why do we think of that differently than we think about the church or the gospel?
Yeah, one of the manifestations of the power of death is all of the ideologies that bear down upon our children every day, every minute of every day. And that if you don't choose Jesus Christ as your master, you're going to have another one. That you are only truly free in bondage to God. And
there are plenty of other masters that are all vying for our allegiance all the time. So in a recent episode that we recorded for Crackers and Grape Juice, another wonderful podcast, Ken Tanner interviewed Robert Jensen. But in your conversation with Ken at the beginning, you said one of the things you loved about Robert Jensen was that God is whoever delivered Israel out of Egypt. How's the quote go? God is whoever delivered Israel out of Egypt.
God is whoever raised Jesus from the dead, having first raised Israel out of Egypt.
Right. And I think that's that's important for us to keep in mind here, that God is the one who delivers them out of their slavery and bondage to captivity in Egypt. And God is also the one who delivers Christ from the tomb. And God is also the one who delivers us from the slavery and the captivity to sin and death.
Mm-hmm.
And that those are all one and the same.
Yep.
The last reading is Matthew 10:24-39. And there is so much stuff in this passage.
Like what, Taylor?
Like, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. Or, and even the hairs on your head are counted. Or, this is, so like when I get these long sections, these long pericopes from the Gospels, I always think, so I always try to preach the whole pericope, but when I read sermons from Bart, he usually only preaches on one verse.
Yep.
And so I think about preaching on just, do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. What do you do with that?
What would
Or
you do with that?
what do I say to you in the dark? Tell in light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim it from the housetops. Which is also like kind of goes against what we talked about with the Jeremiah passage. You know, the whispers that you hear about people. No, don't proclaim those from the housetops. But yeah, I don't know. There's so much going on in this passage.
Yeah,
You can take
like it's
so many
passages like
directions.
this that make me want to, because Brian Zahn likes to say that, God is at least as nice as Jesus, and I'm like, well, maybe like God's just as least as scary and mean as Jesus sometimes. I think, I think, as a closet Mennonite, I think we mistake, the mandate of peace as Christians to mean an absence of conflict, rather than realizing that the insistence on the peace of Christ, and that, in the cross, sacrifice itself has been abolished, including the sacrifice of war.
Yeah, doesn't Howard Watts call himself a militant pacifist?
Yeah, that Jesus is peaceful, in a way that necessitates and provokes conflict. And that's a hard word, because I definitely think, in our tradition at least, we think it's our job to make everybody happy.
Right. Which in this passage, Jesus says, I have not come, for I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's household. Like we as preachers, we as Christians, we can't believe that our job is to make everyone happy, because the gospel itself will rip families apart.
Yeah, I think it's, and I'm sure you hear it a lot too, but like, oftentimes people will want to dismiss organized religion or church because they're just shocked that there are so many sinners in church, and like, why aren't they more like Jesus? And like, one of the things I always want to like point out to them is that, like, you only ever really see the activity of demons and the devil like where Jesus is present in the Gospels. And so like, it makes sense that, you would see the demonic at church more easily than you would see it anywhere else.
Yeah, I hate the cliche, a church is not a museum for saints, but a hospital for sinners.
It's a terrible cliche.
I hate that cliche, but it's true.
It is true. I mean, I wish we had more interesting sinners than we do. Like, that's, I wish, because like,
I think we have plenty of interesting sinners. We just don't ever talk about it.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the one we're best at is passive aggressive behavior, I think. But there are plenty of sinners at church.
Yeah, I remember years ago you preaching a sermon. I was pretty young, like high school, if I remember this correctly, that someone had come to your office and talked about how mad they were at you because their daughter wanted to join the Peace Corps instead of go to college.
And instead of going to like med school, I think it was. Yeah,
something like that. And that this mother was just so angry at you because like she blamed you for this daughter's response. And I don't remember quite what your response was, but it was the equivalent of like, I didn't tell her to do it. Like this is Jesus. Like I didn't tell her that she needed to do this. He did.
I think, and that's the way to connect it to baptism in Romans 6 is that, like, baptism into Christ's death is real, and being, adopting this particular life is real.
Mhm.
And so like, it's funny because I did the confirmation retreat a couple weeks ago, and it like the lesson that I was given was about the members of the body in Corinthians, and it occurred to me that this was the first group of confirmands
That you had baptized.
that I had baptized, and it occurred to me for the first time that like when we baptize them into Christ, and make them a part of the body, we aren't able to anticipate who they're going to become.
Mhm.
And then some of them will go into the Peace Corps, and some of them will become lawyers and doctors. Some of them will become investment bankers. Some of them will become ideologues and super conservative. Some will be motivated primarily by money. Some will be addicts and what have you. And what you're doing in the act of baptism is accepting the fact that you are now a part of someone that you would never choose to be.
Mhm.
And that's to bring it back to what we were talking about earlier, that that's what's problematic about how the church has this impasse about issues of sexuality, that we're baptizing people who may turn out to be gay, and what do you do with them? Because it's like, for Paul, the idea that we are members of Christ's body is not a metaphor, it's real.
Right. But we're also baptizing people who might grow up to be murderers.
Yeah.
Or drug dealers or whatever. We cannot anticipate what these people are going to become.
Or can you say, I have no need of you now?
Yeah. The body has many parts. The hand cannot do what it can without the foot.
So what else would you say here, Taylor?
I would say, fare thee well, my friends. I'm going to a new appointment.
You were done? You think so?
I mean, I just meant that it's my last Sunday at the church. So I would also have to say goodbye.
So how do you say goodbye?
I don't know. I've never had to do it before. You have.
Well, I mean, we're in the season here where, because we have so many people in the military in the congregation, a lot of them are being moved, and some are retiring, and the change in the administration too has resulted in a lot of people leaving. And one thing I've noticed over the years as a pastor is that people don't know how to say goodbye.
Mm-hmm.
And the way they say goodbye typically is by finding something to be angry about. And they like, too often they leave in anger. And just this like past spring, like there's someone in the congregation that I've known for forever and married their kids, and like he just seemed angry all the time. And I could never like understand what he was so angry about. And then like he let us know that he was moving. I was like, oh, this is what he was doing. He was grieving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is a big difference between lay people leaving and clergy leaving, because I can't just get angry at people before leaving. But
you could try.
yeah, what I'm going to do, I'm not going to preach on the lectionary. I'm going to preach the passage I preached my very first Sunday. It's from Romans 12. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It's my favorite verse.
It's Martin Luther King's favorite verse. I think I've already said that on this podcast.
I think you have too.
It's just like we're trapped in this loop of conversation.
Circuitous. But I'm gonna use the same scripture, and I don't know where necessarily I'm going to go with it at this point, but I think to bring full circle the last 4 years to end where I began. And we'll probably do the same hymns we did for my first Sunday and all that stuff too. But it will be weird. And then the very next Sunday, I'll be standing in a new church preaching.
Yeah, well, I think we do that badly as a denomination, but I don't want to presume that our listeners are even Methodists. So,
or our district superintendents. Well, Jason,
sayonara.
Sayonara. Auf Wiedersehen.
I think you should close this out by singing that Shalom song, that awful Shalom song from our hymnal.
I'm not singing that. I'll sing something in German, or I'll sing something in Greek. I can say the Lord's Prayer in Greek. I can do that. I'm not singing Shalom from the hymnal.
Can you sing Dankeschön to close us out?
From Matthew Broderick. I always think of him from Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Come on, Taylor.
I don't know what to sing. I'm not singing Dankeschön. I'll sing a song. from the Comedian Harmonists, which were a German a cappella group from the 30s before the war.
Oh, this is going to be great. Here we go.
You ready? Irgendwo auf der Welt gibt's ein kleines bisschen Glück und ich träume für schon lange Zeit. Du, 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 du. Or actually, how about this? Veronica der Lenz ist da. Veronica der Lenz ist da. Die Mädchen singen tralala. Die ganze Welt ist die Verkehr. Veronica, der Spargel wächst. That means the last line, Veronica, the asparagus is growing, which, by the way, is a euphemism for an erection. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Strangely Warmed.
That's my favorite Bible joke. Have I shared that before?
What?
Adam said to Eve, "Stand back. We don't know how big this is going to get."
That's going to be the tag at the beginning of the episode. Oh, that's great. That's really good. I have not heard that before. Oh, man. Yeah, that's like Ruth going to find Boaz. Uncover his feet. Come on.